Okay, great. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, everybody, so much for being here. I see a lot of familiar faces, so I'm excited to get our third conversation going. This is the third session of our Energy Democracy Teach-In series, as you all know. It's a four-part series dedicated to our collectively authored Energy Democracy syllabus. So I was just going to say a few things about that and kind of what we've been doing so far before introducing our presenters and transitioning into our presentations. Because I'm not sure if everybody is familiar yet with the syllabus or you had a chance to interact with it. So I'll just say, so as energy justice workers and energy humanists, the syllabus was created as a means of collectivizing the work that we do in our classrooms and inviting the broader community to participate in the critical work of educating students, consumers, and political stakeholders in the areas of energy humanities, energy history, energy politics, and perhaps especially the potential for energy democracy and a just future. Our syllabus is divided into four main areas of discussion. So we begin with definitions of energy as a concept and historical phenomenon, in addition to its mobilization as, quote, power. We then work through the various political and cultural ideologies attendant to extractivism as an ideology and political practice, including discussions of racial capitalism and settler colonialism, which was our last session. And we conclude by examining competing notions of energy transition, along with case studies that demonstrate the viability of a just energy transition despite popular embrace of renewable capitalism. Today, we're going to explore four texts from part 3, which attends to energy, quote, transition, an increasingly thorny concept and one that has long been associated with energy crises, whether in terms of the, quote, limits of growth on our shrinking planet or the cascading climate crises that are increasingly catastrophic and enduringly uneven. Although in my graduate seminar on theorizing infrastructure this semester at Florida Atlantic University, we speak of transition, not merely in terms of crisis, but also as a means of imagining infrastructural possibility in the ruins of fossil capitalism. We contemplate the socio-material remnants of what Nikhil Anand usefully characterized as the, quote, material ruins of liberalism, and we work to imagine just futures of the sort imminent to the solar punk imaginaries that Rhys Williams will address today. I don't know if Rhys is with us yet, but he'll be joining us. Williams thoughtfully asks whether conventional, quote, solar infrastructures present a genuinely new beginning from root to tip, or merely a shiny surface, glossing over the rot within our utopian imaginary. And he then reminds us of the disruptive virtue of the literary imagination, quote, in the real life struggle over energy transition, which is also the justification for the inclusion of literary texts in each of our units. So we met last in November on the morning following the presidential election in the United States. And I remember lots of folks had their cameras off, unsurprisingly. It was a difficult morning. We are to resume our discussion about racial capitalism and the wholesale financialization of the planetary commons. And we were faced with the very real possibility that our collective efforts toward energy justice were about to be thwarted in potentially unprecedented ways by the incoming administration. 3 months hence, and following the most ruthless wildfire in California's history and numerous other cataclysmic shocks to global climate, the assaults on our atmospheric, oceanic, and terrestrial commons have in fact been ramped up, as have the assaults on our academic commons, and probably, exponentially over the past couple of weeks, as we know. And of course, the laboratory in which my Floridian colleagues and I, if you hear, have fought, having now been reproduced at the federal level. And of course, the redistribution of wealth from federal workers to the wealthy parasites in the Oval Office is also well underway, and calls for imperial expansion abound, whether the annexation of our neighbors to the north or the hostile takeover of Greenland. Meanwhile, the fossil fuel industries have boasted of a return to oil and gas after having been given sanction by Trump and his minions. But as we learn from Václav Smil, who we're going to talk about today, epochal transitions are protracted phenomena, beyond the material historical fact that there has never been an energy transition so much as a series of additions to existing fuel networks. Even the perceptibly discrete shifts in popular sentiment, whether from whale oil to petrol or what Dominic has termed petro to electro, occur over longer periods. And so did the creation of the monstrous influencer, whose very being was fueled by centuries of settler colonial terror and xenophobic hate. So anyway, The shift to a more robust build-out of renewables is well underway, and American hubris, however shameful, embarrassing, and dangerous, will ultimately give way to either market demand or preferably the ongoing struggle for energy democracy and public power. We thus persist in presenting a discussion around energy transition and the futures of the sun and of the wind as we continue to amble along the road toward a just future. And so today we're welcoming Michael Maloof from George Mason University, who's going to address Václav Smil's the first chapter of Grand Transitions, How the Modern World is Made, called Epochal Transitions. And the links to most of these are also all on the syllabus on the public power site as well, let's say that. We then have Ava Lynn Jago, I think I'm mispronouncing your last name, and my apologies, for the University of Toronto, who's going to discuss the film Asbestos. Scott Stoneman from Mount St. Vincent University will speak to Imre Siemens and Futures of the Sun, the Struggle over Renewable Life. And Rhys Williams from the University of Glasgow shall present his essay, The Shining Confluence of Magic and Technology, Solar Punk, Energy Imaginaries, and the Infrastructures of Solarity. And just to mention, Stephen Power from Montana State was supposed to be here as well. He was going to present on Stephanie Lemenager's infrastructure again and always. He's not able to be with us, but he started a really great resource that he shared with me. So I'm going to put the link in the chat to that as well. And if you're not familiar with Lemenager, of course, she coined the term petromodernity. And in the essay that we are going to hear about today, there's a really great line. She says, infrastructure, like memory, is determinable and designable. So I think it's a good way to get into this conversation. And I didn't say this, I'm Stacy Balkin. I'm an associate professor of environmental and energy humanities at FAU and a membership organizer for the the United Faculty of Florida. And I speak today as an independent scholar on a non-FAU server. And I'm going to hand the mic to my colleague and friend, Ashley Gosson, who will then introduce speak about public power and then introduce our first guest, Ashley.
Great. Thanks so much, Stacy. Thanks everyone for turning up today, and thanks in advance to the presenters. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Obviously, it's a really momentous and chilling moment, as Stacy said, right now in the history of the country and the planet, but also in terms of fossil capital. I wanted to just very quickly go through a couple of images by way of thinking about the current conjunction. So I'm going to share my screen and then do that. So as you all know, Trump at the beginning, in fact, on day one of his administration, promised to terminate the Green New Deal. It's not exactly clear what that means, but obviously for the Inflation Reduction Act, it was not good news. Stacy and I were recently in Texas, specifically doing a presentation at Rice on energy democracy, where we met environmental justice activists who were protesting this coal-fired power plant, NRG power plant, which is smack in the middle of a bunch of communities of color who are coping with all sorts of health issues as a result of that. And, you know, I was showing a couple of films of mine down there that deal with exactly the same kind of problem here in New York. You know, power plants that are located in working class communities of color. And, you know, it's a familiar story all over the country and the world. Obviously, it's gotten much harder to protest against this kind of infrastructure. I'm sure you all saw the news that just was published this morning about Greenpeace being slapped with hundreds of millions of dollars of fines by a jury in North Dakota as a result of the pipeline protest. So it raises real questions about democracy and energy democracy, right? This is a jury of people. So what are we talking about when we talk about democracy and energy democracy? Obviously, we can have racial capitalism and fossil capitalism within a liberal democratic capitalist system. But obviously, what we're living through at the moment is shifting quite quickly. One could argue that green capitalism is being rolled back. Certainly, that's what Trump's executive order seems to do. So I also want to just reflect on, you know, what the industry is saying. These are photographs I took as I was leaving Houston to come back to New York. And during the time that Stacy and I were in Houston, there was this annual conference of the oil and gas industry. So there are these huge illuminated billboards helping the industry promote themselves. And you can see here that there's a kind of still a reflection on green capitalism with the French oil company and energy company Total talking about itself as a company for all energies, including wind, solar, and energy storage. But then the next thing that flashed up on that big billboard was this image of a giant tanker, presumably carrying lots of oil or LNG, with the idea of energy security. And so, I think it's interesting to think about energy security, particularly in the present conjunction, as a way in which fossil capitalist elites and corporations are perhaps coping with an underlying set of economic and potentially political contradictions. And that is kind of overproduction, right? So, we see US hedge firms taking over or getting a big stake in a firm like BP. This is the Elliott hedge fund purchase of really significant shares in BP and shutting down BP's renewable wing. But at the same time, the news that was just coming out while Stacey and I were down in Houston last week was that Texas was breaking solar, wind, and battery records. In early March, 80% of the power in the Texas grid was coming from renewables. So as Stacey was saying, that points to not so much energy transition as energy accumulation and potentially energy overproduction, which might help, explain some of this kind of fossil fascist rhetoric around the need to support fossil fuels and to have American energy dominance. So, what might on its face seem like a very triumphalist shutdown of energy transition by the right wing, I'm trying to suggest might actually betoken a much more complicated economic and energetic situation, one with potential political openings, particularly for the idea of some kind of rational public planning of the transition rather than a kind of crazy market-led and fossil capitalist draconianly enforced energy addition. So all of that by way of my thoughts about this current conjunction and the kind of landscape that our generous presenters are talking to us within in the present moment. So thanks for listening. Thanks for tuning in. And I will turn things over to Michael.
Thank you very much, Ashley. And I'm going to share my screen here. Your points there are relevant here for thinking about our topic that I have today. Vaclav Smil is, at least in terms of how things, what they appear on the surface, aren't always exactly what's going on in terms of how we understand change. So I'm going to be starting off this section here, this unit on transitions, by talking about the science policy analyst and historian Vaclav Smil, specifically a chapter from his 2022 book, Grand Transitions: How the Modern World Was Made. So, Smil was born and educated in Czechoslovakia, where he was a college student during the Prague Spring, which I think had a significant impact on his thought. He taught for years at the University of Manitoba, where he is now emeritus faculty. As one of the foremost public intellectuals on energy and society, Smil has published 49 books, over 500 articles, all on energy economics and science. And although he may have just published another book while I was reading that sentence, since he is that prolific, it seems. Arguably, maybe his most representative text is Energy and Civilization from 2017, where he argues that, of course, energy has had no effect on civilization or culture. And it's claims like that are rather provocative and very positivist in terms of how he sees things, that make him kind of the go-to intellectual for figures like Bill Gates, who always has him in his reading book pile, as well as a darling for the American Enterprise Institute, and a controversial figure among environmentalists who both kind of use him and are frustrated with him, I think, always at the same time. As I'll briefly note at the end, I think there are a lot of misreadings in these responses to his work, but what is important is that he has provided the most important or dominant cultural narrative on energy transition, which makes his work a good place to start for this discussion. So this chapter for today, this brings us to our chapter, Epical Transitions. It is the first chapter in Grand Transitions, and it's very kind of like a generalist survey of the whole book. He has like sections in it where he's kind of talking about it, and then in the chapters in the book, he's going into them with statistics and details about these different things. So his thesis here is that to understand contemporary society, we need to view the creation of the modern world as a concatenated series of relatively rapid transitions. I have a hard time saying concatenated, but it's actually, I think, a key word here in terms of how he sees all of this working. So basically, the book is talking about 5 epical transitions. The first is demographic, with the transition from pre-modern fertility to kind of modern managed populations to kind of what he sees now as postmodern kind of decline in population. Agricultural transition from subsistence vegetarian diets to carnivorous diets and industrial surplus agriculture. The one probably most relevant to us is the energy transition from bio and phytomass energy to fossil fuels. And it's of course important because this is the one in the middle of his 5, and it also kind of accelerates the first 2 and makes possible the ones that come after, which are the economic transition from unchanging low growth over centuries to both now a consistent expectation of perpetual high growth. And then the 5th one is the environmental transition. This is the one that we are undergoing right now. While the other 4 are very interdependent, that's why he has that phrase concatenated, is that these other ones are always kind of relating and building off of one another. It's this last one, though, that is kind of more of the effect of the other 4. And it stands alone in this way. So what is important for Smil in this particular book, in contrast to some of his other books, is he's really interested in emphasizing this idea of what is grand or epic making about a transition. And in that, for him, it means that grand transitions create new patterns and new norms and expectations. He illustrates this in the chapter through 2 stories. He kind of has 2 kind of fictionalized stories he makes up. The first one is about 3 generations of a French family that moved from rural poverty under Napoleonic times to urban wealth just before World War I. And then he compares that with the second story from the 20th century about a Chinese family that grew from famine conditions in the mid-20th century to global wealth at the end of the 20th century. The purpose of his book is to provide a systematic inquiry into how such epical transitions took place. So those 2 stories and what is different between what happens with, say, coal and kind of fossil fuels in the 19th century and then what's happening with global wealth in the 20th century is kind of his important thing. So that's the history side of the book. He also is interested in, quote, outlining eventual outcomes, and that is kind of his, the more provocative and predicting side of the book, which is what makes him kind of thinking about why this book is more relevant to future transitions. So to get to this, if all of this is based on the way he works, is his theory of change. So for Smil, he interprets all change kind of based on this graph. This is something he talks about in this first chapter, is this S curve or sigma curve, which he borrows from science and economics, where it's used to kind of judge statistical significance, or in business to measure or predict growth. Smil views this as a standard that can be applied to all of those epical transitions. It is characterized by its symmetrical curve with a slow developing start, an abrupt start period of growth, and then a flattening. So it's really, I'm thinking right now about this one here on the bottom. That is the S curve. That's important for him. It often takes the shape of a bell curve, but it doesn't have to be. His main point is that there's a very stark, slow growth, and then a stark period of growth, and then a flattening that always happens. You see the bell curve on the side is from this chapter in the book, and it describes the rise and decline of draft horse transportation in the U.S. In labor. The peak is here around 1917, and then with the introduction of electric streetcars in the 1920s, and then tractors, particularly in the 1930s and 40s, you see a sharp, so there's a spike that occurs, and then it declines. And so he uses this in the chapter to illustrate this is how he's using kind of he sees all transitions as functioning in this way. The takeaway is that no transition happens quickly and no growth goes on forever. So in the sections that he's interested in grand transitions, we see this in demographics, where regular levels of population spike with agricultural and medical advances before flattening, and then eventually declining. And then with modernity, similarly with agriculture, the boom with the introduction of oil-based industrial production has flattened through, he talks about obesity, food waste, and soil degradation. In energy, he argues this S curve is apparent with the ways in which coal and oil have flattened in terms of their total energy share. And again, his point is that all transitions occur quickly and no growth lasts forever. Someone interested in a clean energy transition might read Smil and then wonder, I wonder where we are on this chart. Are we going to have a peak soon? Where are we on the S curve of time? But to ask such questions, I believe, is only to reinforce the kind of ideological framework that Smil is implicit in Smil's kind of mode of analysis, I would suggest. But that's kind of what's enticing, I think, about his work to some degree. And just so, for all of their forces narratives, there are a host of problems when it comes to historicizing transitions in this way. As some of Smil's critics have argued, I'm going to cite just two here briefly. Peter Newell, in his excellent book Power Shift, has observed that historical accounts of transitions need to correct for bias around selection. So when choosing epical transitions, mean not examining many other aspects of transitions, types of transitions. And definition, how many factors define a transition? Time, effect, adoption. Most importantly, when does one establish the starting point? So drawing these graphs, as we all know, these are things people make. So where does one decide? Is it the discovery of the natural resource? Is it the first experimentation? Is it the adoption at scale? Where do we decide to make it start? It was a big thing about how we decide how long a transition actually takes. Benjamin Sovacool also something I find useful, just his characterization of academic discourse on transition temporalities, which he distinguishes as two schools of thought, determinist and constructionist. The determinist perspective is exemplified by Smil. It's based on techno-economic analysis and focuses on length, infrastructure, and adoption based on opportunity. The constructivists emphasize social institutional analysis and argue in favor of speed, rapid transition, government interventions, and other kinds. Also unpredictable change and unpredictable things of people, which I think is kind of what Ashley was just showing us, the ways in which two things can be true at the same time as well. And click, there we go. So in conclusion, I think situating Smil in this way is important for reading or teaching him. Smil's arguments that transitions are slow has been interpreted, as you can see in this first quote here from Robert Bradley. And they on the right like to take the idea of a slow transition as confirming the idea that, well, we should just leave it up to markets. And on the left, Smil has often been viewed as a curmudgeon, throwing cold water on policy seeking rapid decarbonization. You see Dave Roberts kind of getting snarky on X back about a year or so ago. I think these are both somewhat misleading. He consistently argues against the free markets and neoliberal economic growth in affluent societies while advocating for smart growth in the global south. For environmentalists, I do think there is some value in engaging with him to help curb some of our post-structural tendencies toward fantasies of green growth, and also just in a way of just grounding in materialist analysis, even though I don't think that we should be taking him as the truth in any regard. It's essential, I think, to engage with Smil if you want to demythologize incumbency and learn to recognize the traps that neoliberal ideology puts in the way of effective transitionary thinking. And I think by engaging with Smil, not dismissing nor blindly agreeing with him, one can begin the work of creating our own historical and future-oriented narratives of energy transition. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. So yeah, I mean, as Smil points out, right, the epochal or grand transition implies a creation of a set of new norms, right? Like not simply the reproduction of business as usual. And as you also so thoughtfully pointed out, right, that, and it's also useful to read this because, as I'm hoping Reese is able to join us, but as Reese discusses in his work on solar punk, right, we need to sort of also do the work of more than kind of fantasizing about green growth, but to kind of look at these sort of material histories. So thank you. Okay, so speaking of the concatenated, a difficult word indeed, terrain of renewable energy, we are going to move to Ava Lynn, who is going to attend through the film The Beasts to the complicated terrain of wind energy infrastructures and their popular expressions or cultural expressions. Ava Lynn, thank you.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of give us a case study because I'm really thinking about this as a, as a teaching syllabus, and I think that this film teaches really well for being able to think about questions of energy transition. So I will go ahead and share. And okay, so I will just jump in. Asbestas, a 2022 film directed by Rodrigo Sorogoyen, centers on the conflict between modernity and tradition in a rural Galician, which is an area of northern Spain, village, where French couple's desire to live a peaceful and productive rural life clashes with local farmers' need for economic survival. The disagreement at the heart of the narrative centers on the offer made by wind farm developers to buy the land, which is comprised mostly of abandoned and dilapidated houses in a town that has lost most of its inhabitants to the city. Many of the rural residents see this as a means to escape the drudgery of their lives. For the French couple, learned cultural elites who have brought their life savings to this project, it is easier to reject the short-term economic gain in favor of a broader vision of ecological sustainability. In contrast, the local farmers, in particular two brothers, feel the weight of economic precarity. They rely on traditional farming practices in an environment increasingly hostile to small-scale agriculture. For them, the wind farm project represents a rare opportunity for financial stability in a region that has long been marginalized. The potential profit from selling their land offers a way out of economic hardship. So this is really a form of cruel optimism that we see taking place. They imagine that the money will go much further than it will, and imagine that they're going to have a total life transformation. However, the French couple's refusal to sell puts the two parties at odds, as the farmers see this decision as a threat to their as the French farmers see this decision as a threat to their livelihoods in future. This clash between the newcomers' modern ideals and the locals' need for survival mirrors broader societal tensions in rural Spain, where neoliberal economic policies have exacerbated inequalities. The film critiques these policies by showing how energy transitions, such as the introduction of wind farms, can disrupt the social fabric of small communities. For the French couple, preserving the land is an ethical choice tied to global ecological concerns, while for the farmers, it is about basic survival in a system that offers them few alternatives. So in 2023, 75% of Europe's population was urban. This number is set to keep growing, leading to abandoned villages or areas where people can no longer make a living or surround themselves with community. The French couple, this is the man seen here, sustain an organic farm and repair abandoned houses because they believe that this will draw more people to the depopulated village. So this is one of the houses that they're repairing, and this is kind of what the village looks like. The villagers, however, fear this as an act of gentrification that will further disenfranchise them. These people will come, says one of the brothers, attracted by the French couple's lettuces, organic lettuces, and the clean air and Mother Nature. But he says, when they see how ugly my brother and I are, they're going to run away shitting themselves. So it's a base insecurity presented as hostility, a lot of hostility, but with a dose of reality, because who is in fact going to live in these houses? The Frenchman's claim that he is doing this for the people of the village seems naive, since all the young people have left and have no interest in coming back. It does seem like the kinds of people who will move there will be professionals who want to have a version of rural life, much like the French couple themselves. This film is so useful to teach in terms of thinking about energy transitions because of the ways that it shows the identity claims and conflicts emerging in these rural confrontations with multinational corporations and governments seeking to address environmental concerns. The cinematic portrayal echoes real-world concerns about renewable energy projects that reinforce existing inequalities. Similar themes are present in another 2022 film, Alcarràs, which follows a Catalan farming family facing eviction to make way for a solar farm. Another amazing film, and I couldn't actually decide which one I wanted to talk about. Both films critique the idea that rural landscapes can be endlessly reshaped to fit urban-driven ecological imperatives without consequences. They also represent the thorny question of what is a farmer. So I want to talk a little bit about identity and identification and how these films are so good to teach in terms of this. So specifically, in teaching the film Alcarrás, it's good to emphasize the discussion about fertilizer, which takes place in one of the first scenes. Fertilizer produced through fossil fuels and with a nitrogen-heavy detrimental environmental impact is, of course, one of the issues that has caused so many of the recent farmer protests in Europe and around the world. Farmers feel that their hands are tied in the use of this government-subsidized necessary import so as to produce the quantity and size of vegetables and fruits that the market demands. It's not only fertilizer that one should pay attention to in this film, but also livestock farming, another nitrogen-heavy practice that is inextricable from a global network of agricultural production. This ties into these recent European protests, which I just mentioned, which have been a response to a series of European-wide environmentally minded policies and targets meant to curb the disproportionate impact of the farming industry on the environment. So some of the things that they're focusing on are, some of the things that the farmer protests are protesting against are the proposed national reductions in livestock farming in order to reduce nitrogen emissions, or on the EU level more widely, the proposal that 4% of land be set aside a year in order to give the soil a chance to recover and get some relief from the constant input of nitrogenous fertilizers. When farmers protest, they do so less as an offended transhistorical mass than as individual entrepreneurs, one interest group among many. That they do this while heavily subsidized by the government and with virtual impunity as compared to other protesters, it is what merits the hatred of other groups such as climate activists or the Gilets jaunes or the yellow vests, for instance, who do the same at great personal cost. And I'm not even going to go in today into the mobilization by the far right of these farmer protests, but in this picture, you can see some of the nationalist and extreme right kind of mobilization that's happening here. So back to the film, because I want to point out one of the kind of arguments that goes on in here. So the French couple who are growing organic vegetables and practicing regenerative agriculture insist on letting their fields go fallow. So here he's saying this land has to rest. To their neighbor, their local neighbor, this is a waste of perfectly good land. And here he's saying, oh my God, what a squandering of a growing plot. So this juxtaposition of like of a professor of a learned man comes across as something very foreign and elitist. So as tensions escalate in the film, the police try to mediate, but they're obviously on the side of the villagers. And here they say, like, you've got to behave better because you're a professor, you're instructed, you've read a lot, you've traveled a lot. So everyone kind of thinks that this learned man is coming to impose his ideas in ways that are contradictory to how things have always been done in this village. They see him as only having spent 2 years here and having been someone who plays at farming. That's what this confrontation is about. The Frenchman's insistence that this is his home and his life comes across to the local brothers as kind of him just being a gentleman farmer, getting to have his little hobby farm and showing everyone that his tomatoes are grown better than they have been growing them. This antagonism, which is based on a true story, ends in a brutal encounter, but the film is a thriller, so I won't give it away. Agriculture remains politically sacrosanct, and this is why this film kind of epitomizes this so well, because it is deeply embedded in national identities, despite its declining material significance and economic role. So I find this article by Marco De Ramo super helpful in thinking about this. He argues that European farmers have now been a protected class for more than 60 years. While initially their subsidies and protections were politically justified when farmers represented a significant portion of the population, today, he says, dedicating a third of EU resources to less than a 20th of the population seems highly questionable. This is a subsidized industry that is maintained disproportionately because of an ideology that positions the farmer, quote, as fundamental, essential to the soul of the nation. And so, yeah, this is just kind of some charts that show some of the statistics about like how much farmers are actually part of the EU GDP. However, in response to the political mobilizations that have been happening with these farmer protests, governments often kind of will immediately cede revoking or weakening environmental legislation. And this underscores, and that's what some of the headlines that I have there on the right. So this really underscores the continued ideological and political sway of the farmer, whose image remains powerful in shaping public sentiment and policy across the EU. These protests are emblematic of deeper societal tensions around the energy transition. This is a shot from the film of a neighboring valley where they have accepted the windmills. In many cases, projects like wind farms and solar installations reproduce the same dynamics of inequality that characterized fossil fuel-based systems, displacing local populations while concentrating benefits elsewhere. This film works well as a case study because you can discuss how rural responses to renewable energy projects reflect broader societal tensions between ecological modernization and economic survival. Students will identify with the environmentalist goals of the French couple, but not be able to ignore the desperate precarity of the brothers. Energy transitions just disproportionately affect marginalized rural areas, which are often seen as sacrifice zones for the greater environmental good. They are also often the site of the devastation of climate change, as seen in this photo from last summer's wildfires in the area in precisely the area where the film was filmed. The introduction of large-scale wind and solar projects follows patterns of historical extractivism, where energy production benefits urban centers while rural communities bear the costs of land use changes and economic restructuring. As the beast illustrates, the proposed wind farm represents two different realities. So here's some of the rural movements that are saying yes to renewables, but not in the way that they're being done by multinational corporations, hoping that there can be more local versions of energy transition. For local farmers, it is a rare, these two different realities. For local farmers, it is a rare chance for financial security. For the incoming regenerative farmers, it is an existential threat to their ecological vision. This film captures the deep-rooted economic anxieties that underlie many rural conflicts over energy transitions, where long-term sustainability goals clash with immediate survival needs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. That was a really wonderful presentation, which bears on so many fascinating issues. As you were presenting, I was thinking about my friend David Hughes's book, Who Owns the Wind, which is also about wind farms and renewable energy in Spain, and really documents how inequalities that go all the way back to medieval times are kind of being reproduced by energy transition. So that might be an interesting text to also assign in dialogue with some of the really wonderful films that you discussed today. So thank you very much for that presentation. Okay, so next up we have Scott Stoneman, who is going to talk about Imre Simon's very recent book called Futures of the Sun. Turn things over to you, Scott.
Can you see everything and hear me okay and all that? Okay,
Yes,
hopefully.
thank you.
Awesome. So yes, I'm discussing Futures of the Sun partly as a way of preparing for a series of public engagements that I invited Imre to take part in next month here in Halifax. The engagements are inspired really by the book's sense that we need to unnerve the eco-capitalist status quo because, in Imre's words, it's gotten us nowhere. I also wanted to talk about Futures of the Sun, though, because I've been having many conversations with people recently about the second Trump administration's really, relentless attacks on the fragile systems designed to protect the natural environment against rapacious capitalism. And the people, especially, given the EPA's initial targeting of environmental justice programs, the people who live in fence-line communities who bear the worst effects of extraction and overproduction. But yeah, just briefly before I get into the ideas in the book, I wanted to share something that Naomi Klein actually said recently in a webinar on the threat of Trump and the surprising resurgence of Canadian patriotism, however misplaced, to try and meet that threat. Klein is known for coming up with this term, the shock doctrine, to describe the ways that our current version of capitalism really thrives on destruction, disposability, and destabilization. In the webinar, Klein revised this idea and suggested that we're now in a period where the aftershock doctrine is maybe a more accurate term. It's a kind of end of days ideology that she says is characterized by an acceptance of the end of nature and the disappearance of a stable climate system.
I think there is a different quality to this stage of capitalist pillage. I think there's an apocalypticism to it that we have to reckon with. I don't think that we are in the age of climate change denialism anymore. It doesn't matter what people say. They know that we are in the era of consequences, right? Where all of the deregulation and all of the this sort of the grotesque hoovering of the world's resources up to, a tiny elite has all of these consequences, and the consequences are dispossession, and the consequences are the serial climate shocks, and the consequences are just making life unlivable on so many different fronts. It's not the end of history. It's not Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. It's really like an end times kind of capitalism where it's really all about fortressing. It's really a battle over where they're going to place the wall of belonging. Like some people want it on the border, some people want it around faith, some people want it around race, some people want it around money, right? But it is what they all agree on is this kind of survivalist prepper mentality that it's like we need to grab what we can in order to survive the shocks that we ourselves have created.
In some ways, Klein's argument is very different from Imre's in Futures of the Sun. But certainly the question of who counts and who belongs is at the center of the book. Imre writes early on in the book that, apologies for the sirens, that actors have asserted the legitimacy of their power now by making a case for their unique ability to take on the challenge of climate change and energy transition. He says there's this renewable center that everyone feels comfortable to inhabit as long as it won't upend the system of global capitalist production. And in some ways, that's very different. At the same time, you are seeing under Trump the kind of resurgence of this "don't look up"-esque kind of idiocratic exception to this conjuncture that we're in. So I'm interested to some extent in the ways in which Trump poses a certain challenge to what Imre's claiming in Futures of the Sun. But let me speak to what the book actually is sort of about, right? If the point now is to draw a border around who is deserving of what is left of the Earth's abundance and exclude those who do not count from accessing the stuff of life, then this would mean that any legitimate or convincing claim to power kind of means repressing and dismissing the demands of climate action as sort of contrary to economic growth. And I think the reason that Futures of the Sun is so helpful and teachable is that it lets us see things in their ideological messiness when it comes to teasing this all apart. So, how can nations acknowledge that on the one hand, a crisis is looming, one that could cost the globe $38 trillion in damages every year, while also continuing to extract to allow extraction that not only exhausts the earth, but threatens to throw the system out of balance, throw nature entirely out of balance. Imre's analysis suggests that what's going on is a reinforcement of powerful connections between national identity, energy, and economic growth that is persistent. It's hard to shake in the absence of sort of a tangible alternative. The problem, Zeman explains, is that this stubborn attachment to a certain notion of what the nation is and does makes the private appear to be public. So the idea, for example, that the Canadian public owns oil when it is in fact owned by private industry. And this makes the consumption of fossil energy an extremely hard habit to break. And in some ways, we do need to, in Canada in particular, think about the problem of Alberta, basically. This is where this kind of branding emerges from, this petro-propagandist stickering. Alberta depends on fossil fuels for about 26% of its GDP, but the attachment to oil and gas goes deeper than economics in places like Alberta, which Futures of the Sun talks about. The province's more cultural or narrative-driven strategies for undermining the imperative to end fossil fuels are based in like public acts of trolling, similar to what Trump does, like voting to extol carbon dioxide as a gas essential to life on Earth, which the United Conservative Party decided to do in November 2024. And it goes deeper, certainly, than trolling. Alberta Education is now proposing a curriculum that educates students in, quote, the importance of natural resources in enabling and sustaining Alberta's society and Albertans' quality of life. So like there's a deep-seated association between oil and positive values like freedom that did not happen by accident. Zeman writes that successive right-wing governments and their industry comrades have educated the Canadian public in the belief that to do anything about climate change is to be both anti-Canadian and dangerously opposed to tradition. And he talks a lot about tradition as this kind of terrain of struggle, similar to the struggle over common sense. We pat ourselves on the back to some extent in Canada and imagine that we produce a peculiarly ethical barrel of oil, the greenest barrel of oil possible, because, in Zeman's words, it originates in a first world democratic country, right? We're positioning ourselves that way. So you can look at the fact that throughout 2023 and 2024, the Pathways Alliance, a consortium of the most powerful players in the oil sands industry, leveraged this idea of a greener, more ethical oil in a cross-country advertising campaign. It reinforced the political importance of Canadian oil, which has influenced even the Liberal federal government's, perhaps outgoing Liberal federal government's approach to promoting its emissions cap, right? Like this Pathways Alliance petro-propaganda clearly kind of infected the language of Employment Minister Randy Boissonnault when he claimed that this long overdue policy of capping emissions meant that Canada would be able to boast the world's greenest barrel of oil. Great, awesome. We love that, right? And despite Boissonnault's obvious effort at appeasing Alberta, you had Premier Danielle Smith saying that she was pissed off at the federal government's regulatory intervention. And we've seen the fallout from basically any of these incremental measures that the Liberal government has tried to place on the industry, with like scrap the cap and axe the tax becoming these simplistic yet powerful slogans by which Pierre Poilievre has really strengthened his lead in most polls. As if it weren't enough for us to support, Canada's green and ethical oil, the sheer power of fossil fuels, as Imre puts it. Now we're seeing CBC and CTV News and Global, repeat Danielle Smith's line, framing the oil sands now as our secret weapon in the ongoing trade war with Trump. So there's a lot going on, right? On both sides of the 49th parallel, this artificial line that Trump keeps talking about, there appears to be a creeping common sense that energy security matters most, and certainly matters more than ensuring a stable climate. There's this, focus on profit, right? All but 3% of Canada's petroleum exports, about 5 million barrels a day of the world's dirtiest crude, goes to markets in the United States. And what Futures of the Sun is trying to do is kind of get past the problem of polarization, and point out that it kind of doesn't matter whether there's a right wing or a purportedly more center left government in power. All nations are failing to take action on climate change. So he talks about German Watch EV's Climate Change Performance Index, which ranks Brazil above New Zealand. Turkey leads Japan and Ireland. Canada is basically last. The index leaves the top 3 slots conspicuously empty, he points out, coming to the conclusion that no country has earned one of those positions, right? No state, no governmental structure at the national level has actually embraced climate-ready energy policy. And so the book asks, why is it so hard to imagine any significant action on climate change and energy transition that doesn't involve decisions made by nation states? And if I had to put it really succinctly, it's because the story we're told is that nations have it under control. We're taught to defer to the nation, to government, or to the market, to industry, because these are the entities that, in Zeman's words, we see as having the resources to make things happen. So there's no need to organize, no need to experiment, no need to worry about the need for radical social change because states have it under control. It's this foundational common sense that limits an acute sense of emergency. So, the gesture that Imre makes in the book is toward what he calls the creation of new international structures and systems that are truly committed to addressing climate change, and to making decisions on behalf of the planet. He calls these eco-political rationalities. And I'm resonant with that. And I'm also, aware of the fact that he admits it doesn't exist yet, and doesn't know what it will look like. And that fills me with a certain level of anxiety from a strategic perspective when the enemy that we face, the class enemy that we face, is enormously, unprecedentedly powerful, and makes it, by virtue of a kind of structural feature of the system itself, hard to imagine that coming into being. Like, that's part of the point. We have stopped perhaps exercising our imaginations and need to do that more. So Imre writes that in the face of a complex problem like climate change, citizens are being gifted the opportunity to stop worrying. And that is partly because our brains have been infected by the neoliberal mind virus, as it were, to cheekily use one of Elon Musk's preferred turns of phrase. Not just a failure, but a foreclosure of the radical imagination. And this is the last thing I'll say. Imre spends a lot of time thinking about a specific billionaire technocrat, not pictured here, Bill Gates, in his book. And I want to close out my comments by extending what he says about Gates to Elon Musk, a noted neo-fascist who is now, unfortunately, an unavoidable part of the 24-hour news cycle. Gates and Musk are what he terms meta entrepreneurs. Because of their extreme wealth, they really have the capacity to make things happen, even things that nation states are too encumbered to pull off. In fact, he says their astonishing social, political, and economic power has become kind of aspirational. It disciplines neoliberal subjects into a kind of hero worship, normalizing a broligarchy, a techno-oligarchy. And whereas, he says states are slow to act, requiring consent from citizens, the meta entrepreneur can experiment with novel modes of production unencumbered. So we're seeing that, to a certain extent, this narrative of social progress is not quite as convincing as the idea of a nation taking a central role in climate action. The backlash against Musk has been widespread, with the exception of hard right-wing jurisdictions, perhaps. But distrust of government inefficiency is clearly making room for a corporate and largely white supremacist, takeover of government programs and the public good. And so I was left wondering when I was looking at the book again today, after, especially focusing on the chapter on Gates, why Imre didn't talk about Elon Musk at all. And wondering, like, does the chapter actually in some ways predict Musk's rise to power under Trump without directly naming it as like a projection or anything like that? I think it's significant that even in ostensibly progressive accounts of Musk's kind of radicalization, his pre and post COVID ideological shift, he's still often framed as a leading innovator in climate tech. This is similar to Gates, right? He's able to manage that position and stay squeaky clean. All the while, as many have pointed out, including Ezra Klein in a clip that just recently went viral, Musk benefits from what Imre terms the flow from the public purse to the pockets of private investors, right? So I just kind of want to leave that on the table and maybe dwell with this kind of contested terrain of efficiency as now a kind of governmental rationality. Yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, everyone.
Wow, thank you so much, Scott. That was great and also very chilling. I've read Imre's book and I've also just finished Valiant's Fire Weather. I don't know if folks have read that, but seeing the banner, I heart Canadian oil and gas, thinking about the kind of petro propaganda that, that acknowledging climate change is anti-Canadian. And so now the quote, the tar sands are a secret weapon, like thinking about that is particularly kind of both horrifying and really resonant now. And sort of the wake of that text, and of course, in the wake of several decisions made in the past week. I too was wondering about Musk's role in this kind of contested terrain. But I want to be mindful of time, and I was thinking too about so kind of how do we sort of, I guess, it's hard to think about Imre's work without also thinking about After Oil and the degree to which we can mobilize our imaginations toward imagining something, sort of beyond the renewable center, right? And so, sort of back to Klein's question, I guess, she says, how do we reckon with the apocalypticism imminent to this collective acceptance of the end of nature? And I'm wondering, not to put Reese on the spot, but maybe the way we begin to kind of reckon with that collective acceptance is through the sort of imaginative exercises that are the terrain of literary analysis and literary study. And so I'm going to introduce Reese Williams, from the University of Glasgow, who is going to talk about his essay on solar punk. Reese, welcome and great to see you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Stacey. Thanks for inviting me. And yeah, sorry I was late. I thought it was at 4, but maybe the time has changed. I don't know. It's like a vernal equinox today, fitting solar punk
no,
theme.
I guess the daylight savings last week here in the States.
Right.
Screwed it
Okay.
up. Sorry about that.
No, my bad. I should be more used to global time zones at this point in my career. And hey, nice to see everyone, by the way. Okay, so yeah. So I kind of proposed this article, and it's interesting because it's 5 years old now, and I think I guess when I was thinking about what to say about it, I'd like to talk about that a little bit. I'd like to talk about the way that, as an object, I think it's useful, but I think it's also useful to understand how it's shifted in meaning over the last sort of 5 or 6 years, and I think maybe that's a more productive way of thinking about this. So, yeah, okay. What am I proposing? So, as I understood the brief for this, it was thinking about how to teach the set object. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how to think about the aesthetics and narratives that mediate our relationship to different sources and infrastructures of energy and different energy societies in the past and the present and the future. And to think about how energy sources and infrastructures, how they're battlegrounds in which competing narratives and aesthetics are mobilized to make them mean something one way or the other, right? And then how the narratives and aesthetics are both added on to the kind of material reality of energy infrastructures, but also how they at least partly emerge from the specific reality of particular energy sources and infrastructures. And then lastly, how these narratives can create communities in the world, and have real kind of political and material effects. And I think it's that last part that I'm going to spend the most time on, because, as I said, the meaning of the article has shifted, I think, for me over the last 5 years. So the article I suggested focuses on solar and energy infrastructure and the narratives that are kind of marshaled around that, and solarpunk in particular. And it's marked, I think, by a certain sort of pre-COVID, pre-Ukraine, pre-MAGA Take-Two enthusiasm around solar and around the capacity of the sort of renewable movement in many ways. But solar remains, I think, a stand-in for a kind of utopian hope and desire. But you know, that has changed its valence, I think, over the last 5 years. It's an exploration of solarity, right? This kind of after oil term, that future version of the world where it's not just powered by solar, but it's a kind of open figure for what kind of world we'd want and how we might get there. And I think, okay, so I think the piece is useful in a few ways. It's a useful intro to solarpunk, firstly. So it gives a series of examples of solarpunk texts and so on. And since I wrote it, solarpunk has only grown. So it's interesting. I think in that sense, it's still a kind of a living body of work. But the kind of core and fundamental elements of it that are identified in the article remain broadly the same, I think. There's a kind of genetics there that haven't changed. And I think solarpunk as a movement is useful because it provides a rich renewable energy imaginary. It shows the relationship between energy infrastructures, aesthetics, and narrative very, very clearly. And it's oppositional to the status quo. Again, the meaning of that particular brand of opposition has shifted over the last 5 years, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But also it's very clearly kind of communal, right? It's an infrastructure of feeling, you might say, a platform for imagination and a kind of gathering place. And I think that's maybe its most interesting quality. So thinking through the aesthetic and symbolic resonances that accompany or define solar in discourse, the article notices that solarpunk talks a lot about light, abundance, and transparency, right? So these are all kind of classic utopian themes. There are, early essays from the 70s about sort of the utopianism of technology and so on. And again, transparency and light and abundance are all kind of coded into technologies when they first emerge, even something as dirty as coal and steam power and so on. So these kind of utopian themes are communicated in solarpunk through the quality of light itself, right? So in the narratives, solarpunk uses light as a kind of vehicle for communal feeling, communal relationships, and it attempts in that imaginary to unite solar power with a kind of reinvigoration of communality, responsibility, fellow feeling, and a sort of general sort of nature forward attitude, if you like. So it tries to make solar technology mean a particular set of things and to hang particular human desires onto it, right? To make it seem like a vehicle for the realization of these desires. So it attempts to fetishize solar technology, broadly speaking, right? It attempts to see that technology as kind of necessarily leading to these desired kind of utopian human kind of desires, right? Now, solar technology and the narratives around it are not all of a piece, right? So solar technology is a kind of battleground. And I think this point, extends beyond solar, obviously, to any kind of technology, particularly, I guess, in this case, energy technologies. So the article goes through a series of solar imaginaries from across the political spectrum, right? Because you can get anything from far-right solar fascism to a kind of neoliberal solarity to, solarpunk. And it drives home how these infrastructures can be pressed into service as the vehicle for any kind of politics. So, the fantasy and the storytelling entwine with the infrastructure to produce a particular kind of future. And the infrastructures are grounding material points for these visions of the future, because those are the things which will ultimately instantiate a particular future, right? So if you look at any area where there's some debate or competition over the right way to do things, energy, food, you find competing visions of the future, which also happen to be competing infrastructural propositions, social and cultural propositions, and political propositions. The protagonists are different in each narrative. Different people benefit, right? And each narrative has different aesthetics. And what it makes up, I think, a useful way of thinking about it is that it makes up a kind of narrative, symbolic, and aesthetic battleground for hearts and minds, paving the way for sort of hard capital investment and infrastructural rollout of a particular future, right? But that first battle, in some ways, is for belief and desire, and for people to sort of want a version of things that you're selling them, essentially. So the way that the infrastructure is realized in the world will ultimately become the political and cultural meaning of it, though, right? So how it's produced and distributed, who owns it, to whom does the money flow, to whom the waste, and so on. That's the real story, if you like. But in the kind of in the moment of working up to that realization, there's a battle for how will we actually do this, and the stories that go along with that. So I've talked a lot about how these stories are sort of placed onto the infrastructures, but there's also in the article some discussion around the basic sort of politics that can be baked into certain kinds of infrastructure, right? So they do have these baked in kind of affordances, I suppose you might say. They're not deterministic in a direct sense. Solar, as we've said, is open to many kinds of politics. But there's also many different kinds of solar, right? So there's rooftop photovoltaic, utility scale photovoltaic, concentrated solar power plants. And there's also then obviously different ways of rolling these out in terms of ownership and where they're made and under what conditions and so on and so forth. And crucially, it's obviously the political and social relations that will be embedded in the production, distribution, consumption of the energy that will materialize that real future, right? That will be the engine that produces one kind of life or another. To give like a really simple example, if I think about the UK and the way that we privatized, most of our sort of infrastructures across water and energy and rail and so on, the materiality of that infrastructure is the same, right, in the moment of transferred ownership, but what the engine produces changes dramatically in that kind of moment. So I think that's obviously a really simple example of that. To think about what I guess in this moment in time is for me still the most interesting thing about solarpunk. And here I want to talk a little bit about, how the object has changed valence, is this idea of solarpunk as a kind of infrastructure of feeling, right? So to take a sort of slight digression, I think at the moment we're seeing, as a number of speakers have said today, a kind of disastrous rise of the right and so on. And I think a big part of that is down to a successful capture of a sort of generalized affect of frustration and anger, which in turn is caused by this kind of clear degradation of quality of life and standard of living, right? In the UK, I think Brexit is this kind of, key moment in recent history where, a great number of people didn't see that coming. And I think that really marked this moment where we realized that we were not listening to around 50% of the population, right? They were sort of these unheard voices with unheard demands and unheard needs. And the fact that they went under the radar in that way, I think speaks volumes. So this kind of affect that's produced by people's relations to the infrastructures of their lives, I think is a big driver of what's happening at the moment. And you might think of it as sort of, Balant's cruel optimism, holding on to this idea of the good life and so on. Or if you take an energy humanities lens, there's sort of, Lemonage's petromelancholia. Or at a less theoretical level, we're forever hearing reports about how the younger generations are the first in 50 years to expect worse standards of living than their parents, or, literally make America great again, right? This kind of feeling of a lost golden era. And Trump is just sort of one particularly bright star in a kind of constellation, right? So in London a couple of weeks ago, we hosted the ARC conference, the Association of Responsible Citizens, which is a terrifyingly banal and dystopian name. And at this conference, we had people like Jordan Peterson, but also Nigel Farage, Douglas Murray, Niall Ferguson, like a constellation of kind of UK right-wing figures. And these articulated the broadest sort of foundations possible for this kind of argument, asking essentially to make Western civilization great again, right? So we're going right down to the roots at this point. And we hear the same critique here from the right wing, and this is something that I find interesting. We hear the same critique here from the right wing that we heard sort of 20 years ago from someone like Eve Sedgwick, right? So the guy Douglas Murray, he claims that the right wing are the reconstructionists, not the deconstructionists. This idea that the left is, just critical and pulling things apart all the time and wrecking things, and actually it's the right wing who are the builders, the makers, the ones who can put it back together again. And the difficulty here, I think, for anyone on the left is that the right wing don't appear to be that wrong in the claim that the US, the UK, and so on are in decline, right? At least as far as the vast majority of people are concerned. And we have lots of, left-wing critical articles or talks that begin precisely with like a litany of decline and so on. But where the right wing are wrong, obviously willfully, purposefully wrong, is in the causes of that decline and in the appropriate solutions. So it's the fault of the kind of mainstream left parties, like Labour, the Democrats, that they seem unable to articulate this broad-based frustration, this kind of clear sense of decline, and unable to articulate a way out as a consequence. And instead, in the face of Trump, they talk about things like preserving democracy and maintaining the status quo, which, as I see it, is precisely the wrong move, right, in this particular atmosphere. So when people feel powerless, they're in what Suzanne Guy calls a situation of restricted agency, right, or a general state of obstructed agency with respect to human actors or the social. And it's from this basis that ugly feelings ensue. So we're in this moment where the past and its expectations are breaking down. And this is fundamentally, I think, an infrastructural issue, right, manifesting through infrastructure. And it's no coincidence that the breakdown of infrastructures from sort of energy and the health service to railways or sewage chimes with this kind of scholarly turning of attention to material infrastructural objects, right? These failing infrastructures are metonymic to a sense of failing society and an index for the general decline. So I think if we think about something like Kyle Bosworth's idea of affective infrastructures, which is this kind of Janus-faced concept, right? On the one hand, it describes a certain form of kind of passive technical alienation. So this kind of affect of alienation and despair and frustration that is produced by contemporary infrastructures. And on the other hand, it describes the attempt by some groups to channel the indignation arising from such a situation back into an affirmative politics that would grow the capacity to organize the infrastructures of everyday life, such that they produce more enduring flourishing rather than alienation. So this idea here of political organizations that might work to build collectives that grow and sustain the organizational infrastructure, these, I think, are in some ways the things that are lacking at the moment, at least on the mainstream left, right? This capacity to capture the affect of infrastructure in terms of its alienation and frustration and so on, and transform it into a kind of a politics of affirmation, right? In a kind of left sense. So the lack of this organization is, I think, for the left at the moment, precisely a kind of infrastructural failure, right? And it's what the right wing is kind of seizing on. So I think you might think of this again in Sedgwick's terms as people searching for a reparative object, right? A lightning rod for their frustration. And what they find, sadly, is the articulation of Trump or the Association of Responsible Citizens and so on. People are, in some senses, reparatively reading Trump, right? Kind of loading onto him a plenitude that, offers their incoherent selves resources. But sadly, obviously, that's always going to be a kind of letdown, right? And a kind of disappointment in the long run. And the left do not appear able to offer an object or an articulation that performs the same kind of affective infrastructural effect. So what are we to do, right? So what should our attitude towards this situation be? Well, we might turn to Gilmore Wilson and her idea of infrastructures of feeling, right? And I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to go a little bit faster. But this kind of infrastructure of feeling for Wilson is she names a kind of set of key characteristics, right? And the key ones, I think, are the process of selection and deselection of ancestors in order to maintain a kind of coherence and a directionality to a collective and to a horizon of liberation. And this, I think, is something like what solarpunk is doing. Now, I'm not saying that solarpunk is the thing, right? And we should all be doing solarpunk and becoming solarpunks. But just as the meaning of solarpunk has shifted over the last 5 years, increasingly appearing to be quite a naive, I think, and kind of enclaved utopian moment, right, in the present, much more kind of realpolitik kind of atmosphere, our relationship to the thing that solarpunk is an example of should change, right? We should attempt to do something like solarpunk, attempts to maintain and create this kind of condition of producing a sort of affective infrastructure, right? Something that allows for capture and transformation of frustrating feelings and alienation. So the task, I think, is something like what Belant calls not just judgment about positions and practices in the world, but terms of transition that alter the harder and softer, tighter and looser infrastructures of sociality itself. So this idea of terms of transition has become really important for me. What does that look like? Apart from just kind of critical kind of takes, I'm interested in what are these sort of things that people can latch onto and which proffer a sort of transformative effect. And just to finish up, I think an interesting thing to think about that through is a question posed by poet and activist June Jordan, who talks about infrastructure as, quote, a scale of looking at things that escape the sundering paralysis of conflict by concentrating on the point, the purpose of your fight. She asks what kind of schools and what kind of parks and what kind of privacy and what kind of beauty and what kind of options would make love a reasonable, easy response. Okay, so that last part again, what kind of schools, parks, privacy and beauty would make love a reasonable, easy response? This, I think, provides a surprising and powerful framing and starting point for co-producing something like this affective infrastructure, right? What kind of an energy system is an interesting example? What kind of energy system would make love an easy, reasonable response? So taking love as a horizon gives us an interesting purchase on questions that can otherwise seem technical or beyond the purview of the humanities in many ways. But this is an overreach because that beyond the purview of the humanities attitude is one facet of the problem, I think. To not consider the human dimension, the affective dimension of our material world and its systems is exactly what brings us to this generally alienated moment where we feel without agency and kind of unbound, right? And it's exactly that void that someone like Trump steps in to fill. So if it's about providing a common place to gather while placing the shared question in an uncommon light, we need to sort of surface certain historical forms for our selective tradition. And solarpunk might be one very contemporary one, but there are, infinite others. And most of all, it speaks to relations of care and maintenance, durability and attention. So not just, what do the narratives and the aesthetics look like, but what do the kind of living communities that produce and support and are sort of co-generated by those narratives, what do they look like? And these, I think, are the key sort of local human scale strategies maybe for this moment. So how to use these to teach? I would say two things. On the critical side, I often ask students to choose a particular flashpoint, so the Dakota Access Pipeline or a particular wind farm or the current controversy about pylons in the Welsh countryside or modular nuclear plants, which are obviously a favourite of the right wing at the moment, or, the 1939 Futurama exhibit, and anything specific. And they then look at this particular moment, what kind of discursive and aesthetic forms have been mobilized around it, what's the history of these kinds of things. And then the other sort of, the other side of it, and that provides a kind of critical take on like how do narratives and aesthetics produce certain meanings for energy infrastructures. And then the reparative side of it would be perhaps using something like investing in the future, the kind of card design game or something like this to produce a kind of communal vision of the future. And it's not just for the sake of, a kind of work day out, you know, team building exercise or whatever. It's interesting to do that because it is community forming, that kind of practice. And one thing that needs to happen is precisely this communal production of shared and desirable futures. And again, you know, solar punk is this version of that, right? But it doesn't have to be that. And I think these two things firstly produce a capacity to see contemporary energy discourse as part of a longer history and to have a critical understanding of the kind of uses of utopian imagery to sell particular futures. But it also starts to build the kind of resources, affective and intellectual, and also communal resources that people might need to push back on this particular kind of historical moment. I'll stop there. Sorry, that was definitely longer than 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Reese. We have just under 10 minutes for questions. We've had amazing presentations. Your concluding presentation brought up this incredible figure of the, what were they called? The Reasonable Citizens Brigade. It sounds like some kind of very bad Hollywood superhero movie, but I think they have a problem, and that is, of course, the chainsaw-wielding Elon Musk, and more largely, right, the idea of terminating the Green New Deal and dismantling DEI programs across the government, as well as, the Department of Education. And Reese, I wonder if you've seen this really interesting recent book by Angus Henton, I think his name is, called Vassal State, which really breaks down how much of the UK has essentially been taken, how much of UK industry has been taken over by US corporations since the Great Recession. So yeah, this kind of question of who owns the infrastructure and how do we imagine that, which you, I think, posed so articulately, is super important for the present moment. But I wonder what kinds of questions other folks have. Clearly in what I've just said, I'm sort of imagining how the fascist control of the state might lead to certain contradictions that could be exploited in various different ways. I think trying to build on what you were saying, Reese. I want to hear if other folks have questions that they'd like to put on the table. And you could, of course, put them in the chat or just feel free to raise your hand for any of our speakers. Yeah, chainsaws and love don't so much go together. That's for sure. Yeah, and I think, what I'm talking about really raises the question of the relationship between a certain kind of toxic masculine national imaginary and, the way it's being rolled out in terms of energy policy, and then how it connects to various kinds of other identities and imaginary scapegoats. So yeah, I would love it if some folks wanted to weigh in about any of those issues. But again, other folks have any questions, feel free to raise them. Oh, it looks like lots of people are having to leave. Stacy, do you want to chime in yourself?
Sure. I was actually going to ask something of Scott, but he's jump off. But I was thinking about Reese's sort of like final question about sort of like what the living communities, more so than just narratives and aesthetics. Like what are the living communities and what are the I guess available political strategies towards sort of harnessing a viable response to the affective infrastructure that's representing over half of not only the UK but the US as well, obviously. But I was going to sort of maybe ask of all of our speakers, or we'll just Reese and Michael at this point, if you want to speak to, are there, I know Imra talks about, a sort of different configuration of the nation state as a possible vehicle through which to kind of work towards some sort of viable social change. I don't know. Are there? I guess I'll ask maybe Reese and Michael what are the living communities or sort of available political means through which to realize these sorts of living communities, or yeah, I'll leave it at that if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Stacey. I guess I could say a quick thing. Just personally, and I definitely, again, I don't think this is an answer to all the problems, but my personal scale of agency at the moment is sort of city level. And I find the city to be an interesting kind of level in the UK in terms of having capacity to do things, while also obviously being limited, right, by its kind of the top-down Westminster structure and so on. But there is a certain level of freedom there and a certain level of autonomy. And as a kind of individual academic, it's a level at which I can have relationships with people in the council and talk to them, and they might listen. And certain things have been happening around trying to create like a little renewable energy community and this kind of stuff. It's not a national and it's certainly not an international solution, and it kind of quails in the face of like whatever, like Russian oil oligarchy. But yeah, that's kind of that has provided me with some agency, I guess, and that it has made some difference. So yeah.
Thank you. I mean, I know I have these conversations with my students all the time about sort of like at what scale are we able to both kind of, I don't know, harness a sense of agency and actually be somewhat effective as well. Sorry, Mike, did you want to speak to that?
Not really. I guess I was so immersed in the SMIL, which is always so grand in its scale that it generally, his work promotes passivity on the people who read it, I think because of its size very often. So I guess I would just say it in the negative sense, like the counter to that is often to ask that question. It's like, so not only just rethinking the temporality of how he constructs it, but then also just thinking about the scale in which he assumes it has to be grand, and when in fact it doesn't have to be. I think the part of the arguments that Sophic about there are rapid transitions at smaller scale. The introduction of different types of stoves, different types of heating within like India, different places. It has occurred. So I do think that it's maybe not so much in the space-wise that Reese is talking about the city, but also just thinking in terms of, well, where are other types of transitions possible that with that can be affected through the kind of stuff that Ashley was talking about at the beginning. I mean, there is a whole corporate realm here that actually wants certain types of transitions to happen, and that is completely separate from the Armageddon that's happening in the central state. So it's almost like thinking like the right wing used to think, which was decentralized, market-driven, but in smaller scale actually is a way which things I think can be adopted because people want them and it's going to function. Whereas this other stuff that's going on is not allowing anything to function, right? It's destructing. So I do think that, so thinking about scale in terms of like that other way, which is exactly what Smill's ignoring very often when he's emphasizing grand transitions. But yeah, it's a good question. Thank you, Stacey. I hadn't thought.
If I could just chime in, I wanted to ask everyone if they know about this wonderful project, and this is sort of very specifically for you, Reese, but for everyone, I think. It's an artist activist project by Dan Edelstein and Hilary Powell, based in London, called Power Station, which is basically trying to turn a whole neighborhood into a power generating station as an example of what can be done. Precisely as you're mentioning, Mike, as a kind of decentralized and relatively utopian instance. And, they are doing all kinds of local projects like having neighbors grow sunflowers, as an example of collective work that's imagining beneficial forms of solarity on a very local scale, but with the implication that it could be done much more broadly. So I think it's an interesting artistic project that's trying to really mobilize the kind of affects about infrastructure that we've all been talking about on some level. So we're at 12:30, unfortunately. So I think we need to wrap up. Thank you all so much for joining us, and thanks again to Stacey for organizing us all. You've done wonderful work, and it's so great to be in community, thinking together and working together, particularly at a time like the present. So I'll say goodbye and turn it over to you, Stacey.
Oh, sure. Thank you. And I was just thinking in terms of like what available communities we have or social organizations. I'm particularly grateful for this one. And so thank you. Thank you for being here and for this conversation. And we're going to, firstly, the recording of our conversation today will be up on the Public Power site. So you can continue to use this as a resource in your classrooms and your communities. And we will be in touch soon to organize a 4th meeting for the final module. And I think I put this in the chat, but I think, Reese, we would all love to see that assignment that, that you referred to with your students, and any other teaching resources I'm happy to collect and disseminate to our community. So thank you so much, everybody. It's great.
Thanks, Stacey.
And so good to see you guys again. This has been great. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, Stacey. See you later.